So the subject matter today is the reorganization of the market economy that the progressives can and should espouse, the productivist project that, in my view, should lie at the heart of their program. And I expect this subject, which is of such great significance for our theme in the course, to extend at least into the first half of next week's class. Now, let me begin by reminding you of some of the points of departure for this argument that emerge from the arguments of the previous week. So the first point of departure is the thesis that the market economy has no single natural and necessary form, and that the most important thing we can do with the market, more than regulating it or attenuating by retrospective redistribution its inequalities, is to reshape it in its legal and institutional architecture. The second theme is that our ambitions for this project should be high. We should desire, we have reason to desire, more than just freedom from the economy once the burden of scarcity is overcome. We have grounds to aspire to freedom in the economy as well as from the economy. The third point of departure is the idea that engagement with the institutional arrangements, including especially for our topic today, the institutional arrangements of the market order, is not an afterthought. It's not something that comes after and has a merely instrumental or technical role. Once we have established, for example, principles of justice on some other basis. Rather, we develop our understanding of our ideals and of our interests by working out their institutional implications. The institutional argument is internally related to the development of the ideals and of the interests. So we could say that any ideal we have, like, for example, the ideal of democracy, always has a double reference. On the one hand, it refers to a series of ideal principles, of normative conceptions, but on the other hand, it refers in context to a particular set of arrangements which we take for granted or have in the back of our minds. When we speak of democracy, we implicitly imagine something similar to the forms of democracy that exist in the world. And what happens is that when we begin to reshape the institutional expression of these ideals and interests with the intention of realizing the ideals and interests more fully, we discover ambiguities or contradictions in our understanding of our ideals and interests that were previously hidden to us. And then we have to resolve those contradictions, pushing our normative view in one direction or another. Now, there is an important qualification to this fifth point of departure, this fourth point of departure. And that is that, as I said in an earlier class, although we have reason, like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, to give primacy to structural change over non-structural change, and that is to say, change in the institutions and in the ideological conceptions with which the institutions are associated. Unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we also have cause to resist entrusting our future to dogmatic institutional blueprints. What we should want is a direction. And that then leads to the next point. This next point is indeed the fourth assumption. That was the third, which is that one of the most important attributes of these institutional arrangements that we should seek in charting a direction is that they help organize or provoke their own revision in the light of experience, that they be corrigible, that they lend themselves to an experimentalist progression. And then therefore the fifth point of departure is that the exploration of structures, of structural discontinuity and structural alternatives must lie at the very heart of programmatic argument in all of its departments, including, as today, this discussion of the productivist project that stands at the center of a progressive political economy. And the intellectual instrument of that exploration of structure must be some theory of regimes or of structures, of formative contexts or frameworks, without which the programmatic imagination remains blind. So those are the assumptions which are going to shape my subsequent treatment of the productivist program. And in this productivist program, once again, I imagine three focal points. And I'm going to organize my discussion around them. The first is the relation of the advanced forms of production to the backward parts. That is, of the vanguards to the rear guards. And in particular, the nature and the fate of the most advanced practice of production in our historical circumstance, and its relation to the rest of the economy, the rest of the production system. The second theme is the relation of labor to capital, and particularly the question of free labor, what free labor is and what its future may be. And the third question is the relation of finance to the real economy, to the productive agenda of society. Answers to these three questions define the contours of a productivist agenda. Now I'm going to try and summarize as much as possible, and summary, of course, has its risks. I will stop from time to time to ask for your engagement, but don't hesitate to interrupt me along the way. Raise your hands as you have questions or comments to make about this argument. So let's take first the great theme of vanguards and rearguards, of the advanced practice of production and its relation to the backward practices. I begin by introducing the conception of the most advanced practice of production. In every historical circumstance, there is a most advanced practice of production. It is not necessarily, when it first emerges, the most efficient practice, the practice that yields the greatest output with the fewest inputs. It is the practice that has the best chance, the greatest power, to reach the frontier of productivity and remain there, and the greatest potential to exert a transformative influence on the whole of the production system, to influence, to inspire its transformation. So it is more than simply the most efficient practice in any static sense, the exemplary practice. Karl Marx and Adam Smith, as I mentioned in an earlier class, the two greatest economic thinkers in the history of economics, both believed that the best way to understand the workings of the economy and its alternative futures was to study the most advanced practice of production. Because they thought the most advanced practice of production is the one that most fully reveals our powers. The most advanced practice of production today, however, is not the same that it was in the time of Adam Smith and Karl Marx. The most advanced practice of production used to be mechanized manufacturing, or its successor, what we have come to label Fordist mass production, which we could also call just conventional industry. The large-scale production of goods and services by relatively rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor in very hierarchical and very specialized relations of production, the technical division of labor. The most advanced practice of production has now become something else, which we can label the knowledge economy or the innovation economy or the experimentalist economy, or simply sometimes the new economy. And it is crudely understood often as simply advanced manufacture. And sometimes, especially in the United States, restricted to the platform oligopolies, like the big businesses of Silicon Valley. But in fact, these platform oligopolies, rather than being representative of the whole knowledge economy, are in some respects an anomaly and depend on very special conditions. So before characterizing the knowledge economy in this broader sense, let me say something about the anomaly and the features that result in its special attributes. So perhaps the first and most important is that those platform oligopolies depend on the economic and social value of the universality of their communities of users. So they're useful, they're powerful, they work because everyone joins them. And that's one reason why antitrust may be a blunt and relatively ineffective instrument in dealing with their problems, as compared with innovations in the forms of corporate governance to assure that the interests of society are represented, and as compared more radically and ultimately with innovations in the regime of property, beginning, of course, with intellectual property. A second characteristic of these platform oligopolies is the very large scale, resulting in part from the cumulative effects and advantages of this attribute of universality, the first characteristic, which allows them to absorb the high fixed costs of investment in the information and communication technologies on which they depend. A third characteristic of the platform oligopolies is the near zero marginal cost of adding a user to the communities. A click of the button produces this result with almost no significant other effect. And a fourth characteristic has to do with a strange lacuna in the law, in this case, the law of intellectual property. It is a form of non-excludability in law, although the economists who deal with the knowledge economy always emphasize the importance of excludability. Excludability meaning the advantage to benefit with exclusivity from the innovation. These platform oligopolies take advantage of a loophole in the law of intellectual property, which is the ability to traffic in the data of their users or consumers, and in effect, sell that data to advertisers. So it is a very specific combination of institutional arrangements, legal rules, and business models, which results in the growth of the platform oligopolies. Let's not confuse the knowledge economy with them. They're a special corner. They have all of these advantages of oligopoly and at the same time excludability. And these are advantages which in economics used to be called rents. So they have these rents from their domination of the market. The knowledge economy, as I'm conceiving it, emerges in every part of the production system. Not just in advanced manufacture, but also in intellectually dense services, and even in precision or scientific agriculture. However, as I've said before, and we shall see, in each part of the production system, it emerges as only a fringe, an island, excluding the great preponderance, the vast majority of businesses and of firms. It has an insular character. It is an insular vanguardism. And indeed, it seems that one of the ways in which the economy changes in the age of the knowledge economy is that the distinctions among sectors of production, which traditionally played a central role in economics, are effaced, not completely abolished, but weakened. For example, the distinction between manufacture and services. Advanced manufacture in the age of the knowledge economy consists to a great extent in the crystallization of services bundled together with production. So how should we characterize the knowledge economy in this more inclusive sense? And I'm going to make a distinction now between superficial characteristics, which the knowledge economy has or manifests already in this insular form that it takes, and deeper characteristics that it suggests but does not manifest completely because of its insular character. A practice of production, now let's generalize, an advanced practice of production reveals its nature and its potential only as it spreads. Its deepening and its dissemination are two parts of the same process. Because as it spreads, in many different parts of the economy of the production system, it shows more of itself, and we can more easily distinguish what is superficial to it from what is fundamental. Now then, at the more superficial level, the one that, as I said, is readily visible in this quarantined, truncated form of the knowledge economy that we have and see, a first characteristic is that it combines production at scale with customization or destandardization. So in the age of conventional industry, the prior advanced practice of production, there was mass production, standardized production, and there was craft production, artisanal production. And craft production never had large scale. Mass production had large scale, but didn't have this power to destandardize. Now we have the combination in the age of the knowledge economy. And indeed, as I mentioned when we discussed European social democracy, a common observation of the specialists in industry is that in Europe, the regions in which the knowledge economy has tended to flourish, like Catalonia in Spain, north central Italy, or southwestern Germany, are regions which were characterized by long-standing traditions of pre-Fordist craft production. So pre-Fordism has turned out to be hospitable to post-Fordism, because it already had many of these characteristics of craft production, and the next step was to bring it to scale. A second superficial characteristic of the knowledge economy, expressed in the so-called Toyota method of production, is that it combines the ability to maintain coherence or momentum in the process of production with a significant advance in decentralization, in the level of discretionary initiative and of reciprocal trust allowed and demanded of all participants in the process of production. So under the Toyota method of production, the work is organized not by individual workers in small niches, rigidly specialized jobs, but teams. And these teams work together flexibly, and they not only implement the plan of production, but revise it frequently as they go along, or at least that's the ideal. So that's the knowledge economy viewed as an engineer might view it. Production engineering, the technical division of labor. But this is not why the knowledge economy is interesting and why it promises so much, although it has delivered up to now so little and often delivered perverse outcomes. So now we have to go to this other level of characteristics. And here I have to say, they are characteristics in a different sense. They're not attributes that the knowledge economy fully possesses and exhibits. They are a potential. So the first is an approximation between productive activity and learning activity. The best firms become more like the best schools, and production becomes a process of permanent discovery. So one of the characteristic technologies of mass production, so-called additive manufacturing, 3D printing, is a visible manifestation of that. It allows you to take a conception and immediately transform the conception into a material form. You materialize your conception. And once you materialize it, you see things about the conception that you could not see while it remained just an abstraction. And you go back and forth from the conception to the materialization. That's like a practical form of scientific experimentalism. And this is related also to the question then, the large question of the relation of the human being, the worker, to the machine, as I mentioned in an earlier class. So what's a machine? What's the point of a machine? Everything that we've learned how to repeat, we can express in a formula or an algorithm. We can then embody the formula or an algorithm in the physical device, the machine. And the machine can do for us what we have learned how to repeat, so that we can reserve our supreme resource, our time, for the not yet repeatable. And then we have this promise, this horizon of imagining the worker and the machine together, the machine and the anti-machine, as it were, the worker with imagination, as much more powerful than either of them alone. And of course, to fully exploit this possibility, the evolution of technology would have to be shaped in such a way that it doesn't simply replace labor, although it must often replace labor, it also enhances labor, which is then this model of the interplay between the imagination and the device. The second great potential of the knowledge economy has to do with its social context. So conventional industry and the conventional form of the market order is based, as I said in an earlier class, on the generalization of low trust among strangers. A market economy in this conventional form is impossible when there is no trust and unnecessary when there is high trust. And the traditional unified property right and the arm's length contract, the bilateral executory promise, are legal expressions of this world of a modicum of generalized low trust among strangers. Well, the knowledge economy depends on a heightening of the level of reciprocal trust and of discretionary initiative within firms, among firms, and in general among economic agents, whether or not they are connected to firms. And that is potentially a momentous transformation in the social character of the market order and of the system of production. Now I come to a third characteristic. This is more technical, but of great significance to the knowledge economy, a third aspect of this potential. If there is a law, a universal law in economic activity, the most plausible candidate for being this law is the constraint of declining marginal returns. So the idea is you commit an input to the process of production, leaving all the other inputs constant. The return to this input increases, plateaus, and then begins to decline. That's the law of declining marginal returns, which may seem intuitive. The pre-classical economists were fascinated by this supposed law of declining marginal returns, but they were unable to understand it. The marginal economists, beginning in the late 19th century, claimed to explain it, but explained it by what is a specious explanation. And I'll try to more or less account for what this specious explanation was. So they said, in principle in economic life, there are constant returns to scale. Constant returns to scale means you have all the inputs constant, you increase the inputs, the returns in principle remain the same. Proportionate to the increase in inputs, a proportionate increase in the outputs. That's the constant return. Now, unlike declining marginal returns, constant returns to scale was never a law. It isn't a law. What it is a defeasible factual assumption, which continues to apply in the absence of an exception to it. And of course, the exceptions to it abound. So, for example, a larger factory can be more or less efficient than a smaller factory, depending, for example, on beneficial or prejudicial interactions among the inputs. Constant returns to scale has the same role in economic theory that, for example, constant motion has in Newtonian mechanics. It doesn't describe anything real. It just says, this is what you assume if you don't see something else. It doesn't have a law-like character. But what the marginal economists did is to say, in order to maintain constant returns to scale, there must be declining marginal returns to a single input. Because if there aren't declining marginal returns, how can there be constant returns to scale? So was the claim they made characteristic for the spirit of marginal economics was the logical inference from the principle of constant returns to scale. But it's ridiculous. So they're taking a defeasible factual assumption, which never had the status of a law, and inferring from it something which has the greatest reason, the greatest basis to be considered a law. So this is not an adequate explanation of the real law of declining marginal returns. So how are we to understand this law? You can think of an innovation as an input. So, and if the process of innovation is punctuated, that is discontinuous, because it is external to the process of production, then what will happen is that you'll have an innovation that is imported into the process of production from the external evolution of science and technology. It will be exploited, it will produce greater returns, it will plateau, and it will decline. So the constraint of declining marginal returns seems to be related to the punctuated or discontinuous character of innovation. To the extent that innovation becomes continuous, ongoing, uninterrupted, then this constraint of declining marginal returns may be suspended. And it's more likely to become continuous if the process of innovation, instead of just being exogenous, external to the process of production, is also internalized in the process of production. And the firms become, as I say, like experimentalist discoverers. The process of production is brought closer together to the work of the imagination. So the knowledge economy, then you might say, holds the promise, unrealized promise so far, of lifting or even reversing this constraint of declining marginal returns. And then you could say the whole history of economics could be charted in three large periods. The history of the economy, not the history of economic theory. In a first period, the fundamental constraint is the surplus over current consumption. Now, Karl Marx thought that was the constraint even in his time, in the 19th century. His theory was society has a class structure because the class is an indispensable instrument for the coercive extraction of a surplus over current consumption. That's the fundamental explanation in Marx's theory of the existence of class society. It's a functional imperative. But we now know that this was the overriding constraint on economic growth only in the most primitive conditions of accumulation. In all the historical societies, in the civilizations, the fundamental constraint on economic growth seems to have been the character and pace of innovation, and no longer just the surplus over current consumption. So, for example, we know that the aggregate level of saving, both public and private, in Britain on the eve of the Industrial Revolution was lower than the aggregate level of saving in the great agrarian bureaucratic empires which had ruled all of world history and existed at that time in the 18th century. So this can't be the explanation. The explanation is innovation. So it was the presence or absence of innovation, the nature of innovation, which was the constraint. And then there would come a third period in economic history, projecting into the future, in which scarcity remains, it's not overcome, contrary to what Adam Smith and Karl Marx both believe. We're on the eve of overcoming scarcity, but the imperative of declining marginal returns is lifted or reversed, because the process of innovation is rendered perpetual and internal to the process of production. Now, having said that, I think it's complicated because the second set of attributes that with which I've characterized the knowledge economy, these depend on an unrealized potential. And we know it's unrealized because of the disappointing rise of productivity in the societies that have witnessed the emergence of the knowledge economy. And that leads to Solo's quip. Solo, the dominant growth theorist of the late 20th century. The computer revolution is everywhere, except in the productivity statistics. And we know that productivity slowed down in the last 3 decades of the 20th century. It had a one-time spike at the end of the century and at the beginning of this century in a 9 or 10 year period, and then it continued to decline again in the midst of this revolution. And then the fatalistic theorists of the discourse of secular stagnation say it's natural that it decline because these technological innovations have much less potential than the technological innovations of 100 years ago. As if anything, in principle, could have more revolutionary potential than artificial intelligence. So this knowledge economy is insular. And its insularity is a much more plausible explanation of this disappointment than the inherent limitations of the new technologies. If we deny the most advanced and efficient practice of production to the great majority of economic agents, firms and workers, how can we not expect there to be a slowdown? That would be a much more direct explanation of the result. Instead of deepening and spreading, the knowledge economy has done the opposite. The firms and individuals who control the commanding heights of the knowledge economy have discovered a way to divide the process of production into two parts. One part is commoditized or made formulaic, and the execution of that part is subcontracted to firms and workers, often in remote parts of the world. And then the controllers of the knowledge economy retreat into an inner domain, the creative and lucrative core of the knowledge economy, which they keep for themselves. So there's hyperinsularity and bifurcation of the process of production. That's one of the many perversions that accompany the insular form of the knowledge economy. So in this situation of the insular knowledge economy, the world is increasingly faced with a new dilemma of development. The new dilemma is this. There used to be a shortcut to rapid so-called unconditional economic growth. This was the message of the development economics of the late 20th century. The shortcut was, in a word, industrialization. So the basic recommendation of the old development economics was take workers and resources from the less productive parts of production and put them in the more productive parts, meaning basically take them from agriculture and put them in industry. Now that formula has stopped working. This shortcut has been closed. One country after another is deindustrializing. Developing countries like Brazil and rich countries like the United States. So what's the alternative? The alternative would be an inclusive, broad-based, economy-wide form of the knowledge economy. But that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist even in the richest countries with the most educated populations. How then can we expect it to exist in the rest of the world? That's the new dilemma, which now lies at the center of the global debate about economic growth. The old thing doesn't work, and the new thing seems to be inaccessible. Because the knowledge economy as we know it exists only in this insular form. Now, I think this is not a true dilemma, because it's not as if the two sides have some kind of symmetry or equivalence. conventional industry is not coming back. There's no way it can come back. The Rust Belt industries in the United States, for example, cannot be revived in their traditional form. They're doomed because what they do can be done much more cheaply in other parts of the world with lower returns to labor and lower tax take. So all we can do is buy a few more years for them through subsidies, through restraints on plant closing, through prohibitions of outsourcing and so forth. So that's not a real option. And what about the other horn of the supposed dilemma? The inclusive form of the knowledge economy. That doesn't exist, but we would have to make it exist by transforming the apparently impossible task of building a knowledge economy for the many into a possible one, dividing it into stages or components so that it became accessible. Now now I go in two steps. So the first step is the consequences of the insularity of the knowledge economy. And then reversing what might seem to be the natural sequence back to the causes. Because the identification of the causes of the insularity leads directly into the programmatic discussion about what to do, the productivist project, to overcome this insularity. Now, the consequences are manifest, and there are two main consequences. The first consequence is economic slowdown. If we deny the productive practice to the majority of agents in the economy, there will be slowdown. And that's the most direct explanation of the slowdown, rather than the specious ad hoc explanations of the technologies having less potential, there's a savings glut, there's this or there's that. The second consequence is inequality. Massive, radical inequality. Anchored in the hierarchical segmentation of the production system. In the deeper and deeper abyss between the advanced and the backward parts of production. And that inequality, based in structure, is so massive that there's no way that compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer, by progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements could annul it. It would have to be gigantic. And long before it reached the dimension necessary to deal with that structural inequality, it would begin to disorganize the economy, the production system, the incentives and arrangements of the established economic order. So the only adequate way to deal with this inequality would be to narrow the gap between the vanguards and the rearguards. And to these two consequences of economic slowdown and economic inequality, you could add a third, which is the denial to the great majority of the labor force of the prospect of working in the parts of production system that allow for greater freedom and creation. It's as if in a country like the United States, the minority is put in this island where it has not just most of the profit, but almost all of the fun, and everyone else is condemned to some kind of make-work. So those are the consequences of insularity. And what about the causes of insularity? Now, it seems to me that if we want to understand the insularity of the present knowledge economy, we should begin with two main families of explanations. One explanation arises by contrast to the earlier, most advanced form of production, mass production. Mass production was stereotypical. There was a kit, a small, well-defined, portable kit of technologies and practices. It was like something you could put on an airplane and take to another country. And second, conventional industry, mass production, was minimalist in its requirements on the so-called fundamentals, institutions and education. I've said this before. So, for example, there was lip service to the worker has to be educated. It's not true. In a mass production factory, the worker needed to be disciplined, to have rudimentary numerical and verbal literacy so he could understand basic instructions, and to have physical dexterity, especially in the form of hand-eye coordination. That's all he needed to have. And with institutions, it's a regulated market economy, a mixed economy that has space for a planning bureaucracy, could give some jobs to the development economists. That was the institutional idea. A minimalist. So stereotypical and minimalist. The knowledge economy is not like that. It's not stereotypical and it's not minimalist. As we shall see, it does have many requirements, many presuppositions. Educational, social, and above all, legal and institutional, in order to deepen and to spread. So let's say that's the first family of explanations. And it's very important because it leads in the direction of an argument about what are the requirements of its deepening and spreading. How do we turn the knowledge economy for the few into a knowledge economy for the many? The second set of explanations has to do with this conception that I've introduced before in the course of the path of least resistance. So there's an innovation in the world. The path of least resistance is the way of adopting and implementing that innovation that least disturbs the ruling interests and the established preconceptions. The insular knowledge economy as a whole seems to be a characteristic example of the path of least resistance. So adopted in a class society which already has large inequalities of economic and educational, it then downsizes the project of the knowledge economy, cuts it down to size, and diminishes its potential tension with the ruling interests and preconceptions. And that then leads in another direction, into an argument about agency, about what changes in the understanding of class interests, of group interests, would be necessary to sustain the alliances that could support the project of an inclusive knowledge economy. So that's the first part of the discussion of the inclusive knowledge economy. And let me stop there and ask for comments and questions about those ideas, because the next step is then the argument about how do we make it inclusive. Seems to me that this is making a strong claim. The claim is that a productivist project today must be in large part about this theme. Because this is what is happening in the world. So, in Das Kapital, Marx wrote about mechanized manufacturing. The world of mechanized manufacturing and its laws. Now we have this other thing. And the other thing exists in this perverse form. So one of the corollaries of this perversion of insularity will come to when we discuss labor. It erodes the whole basis on which traditional social democracy rested. This was the social basis of social democracy. The world of a stable labor force assembled in large productive units like factories under the aegis of large corporations, unionized. Now, in every country in the world, we have the precarization of labor. More and more, less and less of the labor force is organized and in stable employment. More and more of the labor force is in precarious employment, temporary, conditional, unstable. As I said in the earlier question, subjective petty bourgeois, oriented to this ideal by default of modest prosperity and independence, with the default version of that, which is traditional archaic family business, but poor in rich countries and poor in poor countries. And that's the situation that we now have. So the hyperinsularity of the knowledge economy has had as one of its corollaries this abandonment of the major part of the labor force to precarious employment. So something that had such great promise to bring wealth and productivity and freedom has appeared in a form which is in many ways disastrous. So that's what makes this debate so urgent and so necessary that the progressives have a position about it. And for the most part, they don't have a position anywhere in the world. So this dilemma of development that I just described does not elicit from the progressives a coherent and forceful response. That's a central claim that with which I end this argument. No? Yes.
Professor, I have two questions. The first is when we say the exploration of the structure, either in form of structural organization, I mean the new way of structuring it, or structural continuity. So where do we locate this? We locate this new form in something which has not worked earlier, the earlier templates, whether they are historical or
I'm not sure I understand. So are
So
you referring to the knowledge economy
yeah.
in
So
its perverted insular form? Is that what you're saying?
No, at the beginning when you were giving us the various themes in that, one was our ambition for the projects that we should have them high, and then second was engagement with institutional arrangements, and then there have to be primary to the structural change, and then the fourth was the exploration of that structure. So the exploration of the new structure or structural rearrangements, where would we want to emulate, which has not, which has worked earlier in the historical way, but we do not have much historical examples, because even if you take the American constitutionalism and reconstruction which has occurred here or in India, they have not worked.
I wasn't supposing that this would be an exploration of the inclusive knowledge economy, because as you say, the inclusive knowledge economy doesn't exist. It's a construction. What I had in mind was an exploration of the regime, the institutional arrangements of the present market order, and of the present form of politics, of democratic politics. How do we think about the reconstruction of these institutional systems? And there we get back to the basic problem. So Marxist theory, classical social theory, including Marxism, had this idea that there are these systems. One of these systems is what Marx called capitalism. The system is there on a take it or leave it basis. So either you change capitalism and replace it with something else, or you manage it. Huh? You humanize it. You attenuate its inequalities. The claim I made there is that argument is false. It's a characteristic example of an inadequate theory of regimes. It's not a system. There aren't these systems. Structural change, when it takes place, is fragmentary. And so, but that doesn't exempt us from now asking which fragmentary structural changes open the path from a knowledge economy for the few to a knowledge economy for the many. And we have a similar discussion about democracy and so forth. So you need to have the right way of thinking about regimes. Otherwise, as I say, you're lost. And we're back to that dilemma that I said in the very first class threatens to paralyze the programmatic imagination. It's either utopian or it's trivial, and that has to do just with the proximity to what exists, and because you don't really have a way of thinking about structural change. And then contemporary social science, for the most part, simply evades the discussion of structural change. So it doesn't suffer from these particular taints of the Marxist determinism, but only because it's altogether suppressed the imperative of structural imagination. The imagination of structure is the very heart of a programmatic idea. And you can't just have normative conceptions if you don't have a vision of how they then become embodied in the transformation of forms of social life. Yes.
I'm wondering if a certain kind of feudal system or colonial system actually enabled this kind of knowledge economy, this kind of routine work to get more evangelized, as opposed to ensuring a knowledge economy which is more built with creators and innovators, but it doesn't seem to have a political or a social system that supports this honeycomb of entrepreneurs, as opposed to.
So what are you saying? Are you saying that the colonial oppression prevented the knowledge economy from emerging?
Yes, I mean some of
So it has emerged. It's emerged in India, it's emerged in Brazil, it's emerged all over, but it's emerged in this insular form, in this perverse form.
Yeah, that's what I meant. That maybe it's enabled it to happen much faster rather than. Well, it may have emerged in India, but there is, given its population, it's by proportion, it's still very small. A lot of it is still routine work.
Yeah, so let me reformulate this, because in part your comment is a comment about culture. In most of the world, outside the United States, and even in Europe, the life of the intelligentsia is divided into two main parts. So one part is a kind of shrunken or fossilized Marxism, in which the heroic assumptions of Marxist theory of society or history are not really believed in. But the vocabulary is still spoken. So capitalism, class conflict, and so forth. Socialism is an alternative to capitalism. And so there's this confusion, because they don't really believe in transformation. What they do believe in is a kind of historical fatalism, which is what they get from Marx. So that's why I've said they've thrown out the good part and kept the bad part. So that's a large part of the life of the intelligentsia. The other part of the life of the intelligence is the imitation of American-style social science and policy discourse, which is completely anti-structural. Social life consists in a grab bag of practical problems and in discrete technical solutions to them. There are no great structural problems. And the way of thinking about the institutions is that they are like the empirical residue of a long history of acts of functional adaptation. You discover what works, there's a progressive convergence to the best institutions and practices, and then the leading powers disseminate this. So all around the world we have this problem of mental colonialism. Even when there is nationalist fervor in the rejection of colonialism, the ideas are these imported ideas. And this is even in the greatest powers. So for example, in the Central Party School in Beijing, the school in which the Chinese Communist Party trains its cadres, most of the time, you know what they're discussing? They're discussing. They pay lip service. There's a formal homage to the Marxist framework. They're discussing second and third-rate American social science and policy discourse. You know, they're in Beijing. They're talking as if they were discussing the latest report from the Kennedy School. So this is it's incredible, but this is the reality of what we have in the world. Yes.
I was just kind of building off this question from Akshay. I'm curious to hear more in the causes of this divide of rearguard and vanguards.
Yes.
And this massive inequality in
Yes.
the knowledge economy. Maybe I missed it, but I didn't really hear the financial makeup or the financial structure that produces this knowledge economy as another cause of this problem. And I'm
You mean
curious.
the relation of finance to all of this?
Yeah, and just how, for example, VC funding works to sort of spark innovation. It's very much structured in a way that produces this insularity
Yeah,
around.
well, because I'm trying to separate topics. So I'm going to come to the topic of finance and the real economy. But I'm trying to avoid dealing with everything at the same time. So I don't think, with respect to this issue of the insularity of the knowledge economy, that finance is in itself the decisive or prohibitive obstacle. There's an additional factor, because these economies have become financialized, and finance has a parasitic and predatory relation to the real economy. But one reason why it's one of the enigmas about finance is that what in principle would be the most important activity of finance, which is the creation of new assets in new ways, represented by venture capital and its equivalents, is in every economy in the world, even in the economies where venture capital has the largest role, proportionately, like the United States or Israel, minuscule. It's a minuscule part of the activity of the capital markets. Meanwhile, the production system overwhelmingly finances itself. The overwhelming finance of production is internally generated within the production system itself on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. And then there's this vast pool of liquid capital in the banks and stock markets. What is it for? So we have to come to those mysteries also, because they're all connected. But and there the problem is not the speculative element in finance, because speculation has a legitimate role in the discovery of information and the allocation of risk. The problem is the detachment of the speculative element in finance from the productive agenda. It's not the speculation as such, the gambling, the betting. It's the disconnection between that financial engineering and the task of inventing and producing stuff. So of course, that's all part of this background. But what I think is that if we see all of these things as, and they are in a sense all connected, but if you see all of them as some kind of system in which everything is connected to everything else, the natural reaction is to say, well, then there's nothing we can do about it. And that's, I think, the false reaction. So my whole effort is to say they are connected, but they're not a system. And they can be attacked piece by piece, part by part. We can proceed by this logic of combined and uneven development. And this avoids what is one of the characteristic distortions of the idea of thinking of everything as a system, like the pseudo-Marxist mode, right, in which you say, real change would be the substitution of capitalism for socialism. No, that's not in the cards. And if it were in the cards, it would be too dangerous. So what's left to do? What's left to do is to humanize the world. So the ex-Marxist becomes then a resigned social democrat. And those are the people who govern many of the countries in the world. They have a Marxist background. Now they've grown up. They put aside these revolutionary fantasies. They understand it's impossible if you think of it as a system. So what are they going to do? They have to wait for the next world war. That's the situation. I'm unwilling to accept that result. And that's a way of describing the center of this debate. There has to be an alternative which we can think about in these non-systemic forms. Do you really want me to go ahead? Because that's the implication of your silence. Okay.
If I may, then can I ask a question?
What?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, you can ask a question.
So, Professor, the thing is, as we see the fragmentary nature and that we need to go where it could be a process of a continuous change and innovation, but then also thinking about Marxism, just bringing it into context again, it did not really, when you go to another positioning, it did not really work in India, as many feel, because there wasn't any precondition which was created, even if it was located in the class, creation of a class. Because the caste system itself caused a division in the laborers, preventing from a class to emerge. And therefore the precondition of Marxism itself was not fulfilled in India. So when we want to reimagine when the previous condition is not fulfilled, and then how do we go to another better place?
What exactly are you asking then?
So what I basically wish to know is, in societies, their preconditions to the basic emergence of class have also not been met. How would this particular way work out or evolve?
I don't think that's the right way to think, because then you think, well, there are all these preconditions for some momentous change happening. If you look at it from afar, of course, but you intervene in a particular area, and that then has repercussions over these structural conditions. So the construction of a more inclusive knowledge economy, a knowledge economy for the many, begins to exert pressure on these surrounding social realities, like the realities of class and caste. It's not as if you first change the whole class and caste character of society, and then on that basis, you have some different productivist project. There isn't this kind of linear sequel in a real historical process. So on the basis of this kind of argument that I propose, we do have a suggestion of where to begin in imagining the development of a knowledge economy for the many. It depends on requirements. And let's separate these requirements. So to me, the most important requirements are the legal and institutional requirements. But they're not the only ones. So let's start with the other ones. So for example, there are educational requirements. Conventional industry, mass production, did not require intensive education. The knowledge economy does require a distinct kind of education. And not just general education, but also technical education. So, the old model of technical education was the German model. You're trained in job-specific and machine-specific skills. For this or that trade, to use the traditional lathes, the traditional metal cutting devices, and so forth. The knowledge economy requires that the worker be trained in the higher order conceptual and practical capabilities that are needed to operate numerically controlled machine tools. But that is on a continuum with the kind of general education that is required. And the kind of general education that is required must emphasize the analytic and synthetic capabilities of the mind, of the imagination, over the mastery of information. It must attempt to acquire these capabilities, dealing with content, because you don't acquire capabilities in a vacuum of content. You acquire them dealing with content. But what matters with respect to content is not encyclopedic superficiality, scope, it's depth, selective deepening. So therefore, a form of education that is thematic or project-oriented. Third, the social setting of education must be cooperative, rather than the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism that characterizes traditional education. And fourth, and the most important, education must be dialectical. That is, every subject must be taught from contrasting points of view. Every subject must be taught at least twice. This is the way of undermining the forced marriage of subject matter and method that characterizes the university system. And of course, this is on the method of teaching and learning. But if you take countries that are large, unequal, and federal in structure, like the United States or Brazil, there's an indispensable practical background to this, which is you have to be able to reconcile the management, the local management of the schools, the management by states and municipal governments, with national standards of investment and quality. And to reconcile local management with national standards, three things are necessary. You need to have a way of assessing what works or doesn't work, school by school and student by student. You need to have a mechanism of redistribution to redistribute resources and staff from richer places to poorer places. So the school system can't depend on local finance, as it does, for example, in the United States. And third, you need to have a procedure for corrective intervention. When, despite all, a local school system repeatedly falls beneath the minimum acceptable threshold, because Otherwise, you can't implement the principle that the quality of education the young person receives must not depend on the happenstance of where it's born. So it can be a trans-federal structure in which the different levels of the federation associate in common bodies and take over temporarily a local failing school system, allocate it to external reformers, fix it as you might fix a failing business in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and return it fixed. There has to be some such procedure. Otherwise, you can't have this principle. So, the project of a deeper and disseminated knowledge economy does require an educational revolution. And we know that educational revolutions have been national revolutions. They're associated with projects of national liberation in many parts of the world. This was Sarmiento in 19th century Argentina, Vasconcelos in 20th century Mexico, to some extent John Dewey in the United States in the 20th century. Now, then there's the social moral requirements. I said, the deepened and disseminated knowledge economy requires a heightening of the level of reciprocal trust and discretionary initiative allowed and required of all participants in the process of production. So not just that modicum of low trust among strangers, but a heightening of the level, an accumulation of social capital, as the sociologists would call it. And then we have the question whether the level of trust or of social capital is a constant or a variable. Is it something that we can create? And I do affirm that we can create it by a series of initiatives. For example, the cooperative character of education, or the organization of civil society outside the state to partner with the state in the experimentalist and cooperative provision of public services, not for profit, as the best way of enhancing their quality. So I think we touched briefly on this. The dominant form of providing public services in the world is administrative Fordism. The provision of standardized low-quality services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And low quality in the sense that they're of lower quality than the equivalent services that might be bought on the market by someone with money. And then the only alternative to this administrative Fordism appears to be the privatization of the public services in favor of profit-driven firms. But there's another alternative, which is the state help organize civil society, equip it, finance it, monitor it, for civil society then to participate in the form of cooperatives of some kind, of health workers, of education workers, and so together with the state in the experimental competitive provision of public services. So in other words, the state provides a universal floor. The state operates at the ceiling in the provision of the costliest and most complicated services. But in the broad middle range between the floor and the ceiling, the state partners with independent civil society in the provision of the services. And another example would be mandatory or voluntary public social service. Military service, or when the young are exempted from military service because they're not needed for that purpose, mandatory social service. So we could have a series of initiatives which in their cumulative outcome would elevate the level of social capital, the density of association, the willingness and ability of people to cooperate with one another is also then part of the background to the deeper and disseminated knowledge economy. Now then we come to what I think is the most significant requirement. The legal and institutional requirements. The existing form of the market order is not good enough to serve as a framework, as a basis for a knowledge economy for the many. So we have to imagine a step-by-step process, a succession. Remember, in a programmatic argument, the two most important things are to chart a direction and to determine which are the initial steps in a particular circumstance by which to begin to move in that direction. So imagine 3 stages. So in the first stage, the aim is to broaden the access of a much larger cast of economic agents to productive resources and opportunities. The resources, the opportunities, the capabilities needed for participation in a knowledge economy for the many. Now, who are these agents? On the one hand, they're the small and medium-sized firms that are mainly in the rear guard of the economy. And on the other hand, they're individual economic agents who have no stable connection to any business enterprise. And they would have to be lifted up. Now, they would have to be lifted up by a 21st century equivalent to the 19th century agricultural extension. Remember, I gave the example of the organization by the Americans in the first half of the 19th century of family-scale agriculture with entrepreneurial attributes. And I said, one of the main instruments was the government, the national and local government, bringing the know-how, the knowledge, the agricultural science to the farmer at the gate, lifting him up. And so the backward firms would have to be given more access to these resources in a form that they were capable of assimilating. So that then leads to the question of the evolution of technology. The reinvention of some of these contemporary technologies in the form that makes them assimilable by the rear guard, given where it starts from. And always with this pedagogic idea that the challenge is always just a little beyond the reach of where they are, because that's how you get them to advance. And the state has to intervene then to inform, to influence the evolution of technology, so that the technology evolves in a way that doesn't simply replace labor, though to some extent it always will replace labor, but also in a form that enhances labor. So the aim then is to transform those individualized economic agents, disconnected from the business enterprises, into technologically equipped artisans. Like the nurse practitioner, the machine repair person, and so forth. It's elevating the level, step by step, of the rear guard, so it's not just the backward, archaic, formulaic make word, but has a connection to the knowledge economy. And then a third component in this first stage is discovering retrospectively and experimentally what works. What are the successful experiments, and disseminating them nationally and globally, rather than dogmatically fixing on one path a priori and attempting to push it. So let's say that's all the first step. And by the way, most of what I've described as being in this first step already exists in many places in the world in one form or another. So it's not as if this was some kind of invention from Mars. This is a reshaping of things that are at hand, right? And then you can imagine a second step in which out of this material, which I've described, there begins to emerge a different architecture of government-business relations. So we have now on offer in the world two main models of government-business relations. We have the American model of arm's-length regulation of business by government, and we have the Northeast Asian model of the formulation of unitary trade and industrial policy imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. We would need to have a third model, a form of strategic coordination or partnership between governments and firms or agents that was pluralistic, participatory, and decentralized and experimental. And so that begins to be a reconstruction of the market order. That's on the vertical axis of the relations between governments and firms. And on the horizontal axis of relations among firms, just what the Americans did in the early 19th century, going back to the example of agriculture. Cooperative competition. So they're different, they're independent proprietors and entrepreneurs, but they also cooperate to achieve economies of scale. That's cooperative competition. And cooperative competition already goes on massively in some parts of the advanced economies. For example, in the pharmaceutical industry. And then, in the third stage, only in the distant future would we then get to the more radical innovations in property, beginning in intellectual property, but ultimately in property itself. And that's the idea that I evoked early in the course of capitalism without capitalists. That was my thought experiment, in which we say, imagine the productive assets of society, its liquid capital and technological resources, vested in independent trusts. And these trusts conduct a kind of permanent rotating capital auction. So that's the basic idea. So no one owns the productive resources of society perpetually or without limit. You own them so long as you can assure society the highest rate of return. By the way, under that system, the rate of interest, which is the underlying rate of interest, which is the charge for the use of the productive resources of society, becomes the main form of public finance instead of taxation. So you have a capital auction. Capital is auctioned off to its most productive uses. Now, as I said before, that's what it's already supposed to be. That's, according to official finance theory, that's exactly what a capital market is now. Now, so they say, if it's perfectly competitive and it has no asymmetries of information, it allocates capital to its most efficient uses, and independently of who originally owns the assets will end up in the hands of the most effective users in the course of time. And there'll just be some contingent distributive consequences along the way, depending on the sequence of ownership. But you tell me whether the thought experiment is equivalent to what already exists. So they're saying we won't trust this myth to be implemented. We'll make it implemented. That would be the now, of course, I'm not supposing that there'll be one, will be the only regime of property. The market economy should not be crucified on the cross of a single dogmatic version of itself. There should be alternative regimes of property. And one of those regimes should be the traditional unified property right. Because as I also said before, the unified property right has a tremendous advantage, which is to allow an individual entrepreneur to do at his own risk something that no one else believes in. So we should have room for that also. But there's no reason why we have to make the capital market be represented by a unique version of itself. That's the point of this thought experiment. So now this is a very long trajectory. And so the first step of these three stages that I described, the first one is very close to what already exists. The third one seems impossibly remote and radical. And there's a huge distance here, but it's a direction which you can understand. And what matters is whether a particular change moves in that direction or not. Now you can ask the following question. So I've described these educational requirements, the social capital requirement, and the legal institutional requirement. You can ask, in general, what conditions in society make it more or less likely that a society will be able to satisfy these requirements? And it seems to me that the two main conditions are one cultural and the other political. The cultural condition is radical experimentalism in every department of social life. Tinkering, endless tinkering and experimentation in every field of culture and society. Facility for people to reinvent themselves, for example. And that can also be part of the responsibility of the state. And why not? For example, if you're a small European country and you have a lot of money, why don't you use some of that money as a venture capitalist to invest in the young people to go all over the world, try out businesses and philanthropic or social enterprises. Then they come back home shaken by what they've seen in the rest of the world. That's a way of changing people. And the principle is simple. You're not condemned to live a small life if you happen to have been born in a small country. The whole world can be the theater of this experimentation. The second major condition is a high energy democracy. And we're going to discuss that more later. So a democracy with a high level of political mobilization, of organized popular engagement in political life, rapid resolution of impasse to hasten the pace of politics. So you raise the temperature of politics, you hasten the pace, and you combine a facility for decisive central action with radical devolution. So as a society goes down a certain path, it hedges its bets by allowing parts of itself under certain conditions to diverge from the predominant solutions and generate counter models of the national future. Now that makes it all sound like one big system, right? Because you go with the requirements, there's the conditions, and so it's like this all or nothing business. And I think that's a complete misreading of the intention. Because the truth is that you begin with this modest idea of uplift, the uplift of the rear guard. And as you proceed along this line, then the scope of ambition increases. Because in a process of combined and uneven development, you go as far as you can in one part until you hit on a constraint imposed by failure to change other parts. And then you go from one thing to another with greater clarity about the direction. Now, remember when I was speaking about the causes of insularity, I said there are two main families. One family has to do with the requirements of the knowledge economy being much more demanding than the requirements of conventional industry. The other, I said, was the path of least resistance, the downsizing of innovation to the form most easily reconciled with the established order. And that second explanation of insularity then leads in another direction, which is the direction of thinking what ways of reinterpreting class interests or group interests would be required for this project. And it seems to me there are three crucial groups. So one group are the entrepreneurs, the industrialists in a society have to distinguish themselves from the rentiers. And there has to be some conflict in which the productivist interests define themselves by opposition to the purely parasitic rent-seeking interests. And they then are supported by parts of national politics in this project. The second constituency are the workers, especially the workers in what used to be the vanguard, the capital-intensive Rust Belt industries, the conventional industry. They and their leaders have to come to the conclusion that there's no future in trying to bring traditional industry back. That has to be converted into something else, into a version of the knowledge economy. And in that process, the groups that they used to think of as their rivals or enemies, including the small business class or the temporary workers or the foreign workers, they have to begin to think of as their allies. And then the third crucial constituency is the small business class and the mass of still poor people who, as I said, are subjectively petty bourgeois. And that is perhaps the most difficult part of this construction. They have to be converted to this idea that there's an alternative to archaic, isolated family business as the vehicle for the fulfillment of their aspirations. And this then becomes one of the main tasks of the left. Because as I say, the subjectively petty bourgeois are now the majority of humanity. The traditional labor class, working class, in the capital-intensive parts of the economy are a minority. And they're a minority that is increasingly seen and sees itself as just one more special interest. So it's the rest that have to be won over. That's the idea. So I've stated my outline, and at least the first subject of this productivist project in this class, so we can devote the next class to the other two. Now, what do you think? Yes.
Can I ask a question about education? It seems like as the manufacturing industry in America started to hollow out, a lot of the messaging that I started to hear from political leaders was that if people wanted to participate in this shift, that they should get a college education. There was a re-emphasis on higher education.
Yes.
But now, with the rise of this kind of plutocratic populism that seems to be spreading, it seems like people are increasingly, especially working people, disillusioned with the culture of higher education. There's a lot of kind of, in all of this culture war, it's all about education. And so I'm wondering what the solution to that impasse is.
Well, I don't think so. First of all, from the past, from the 19th century, and coming from the immense influence of Europe around the world, The idea was a decoupling of general education from technical education. So there's general education for the elites and technical education for the workers. In the United States, that idea was never fully accepted. But what happened in the United States is that public education, for the most part, became a disciplinary operation, right? So, encyclopedic knowledge, discipline, control, command and control. It's like education for a world that doesn't exist anymore. And then an elite part of the educational structure was spun off, guided by John Dewey's ideas. Progressive education. And it accepted this idea of cooperative problem solving and analysis as the focus of education, but it rejected part of Dewey's program, which was the critical part, and replaced that by the attempt to emulate and promote a certain model of sociability. No, that's the United States. So what I think is that there shouldn't be a prejudice against technical education. Technical education, as I described it, is on a spectrum, on a continuum with general education. It's no longer an education in job-specific and machine-specific skills. It's an education in these higher order flexible capabilities. And there's no reason to be prejudiced against it, against its practical character. So the practical character is not bad, it's not good. It's not bad, it's good. And that goes all over. So for example, professional education. Here we are at Harvard Law School. So the education in the elite American law schools it's a very strange thing. This is the problem of legal education around the world. It's neither theoretical nor practical. So they don't get any theoretical knowledge, and they don't learn how to do anything. So what do they learn in law school? They learn to deploy, emulate a certain argumentative, analytical, and rhetorical style. They learn the way to talk. It's more like learning how to play the piano than it is like figuring out Euclidean geometry. Then at the end, they go and take some cram course to take this bar examination. So the memorization of the rules is factored out from what goes on in law school. Law school is training in this rhetorical apparatus. The students then graduate first under a debt burden, which makes them feel that they have to go into big law to pay off their debts. But secondly, feeling that they don't know how to do anything, and they have to go into big law to learn how to do something. So it would be necessary to liberate them from the debt burden, but also to teach them intensively the practical stuff in law school. The law partners in big law are desperate to leave their firms, bored, having midlife crises. They would love to come. So cut out all the prejudices and bring them over to teach these people this stuff so they feel they don't have to go into big law. So the reason why I'm giving this example, aside from its local relevance, is that it's that practice is not an enemy to theory. That is, the practice and theory are united, should be united. Their enemy is all the other stuff. And so there's nothing wrong with technical education. It's an instrument of empowerment and therefore freedom, autonomy. People can do things. And if the practical education is not archaic, if it's contemporary, it's on the same line, on the same page with theoretical education. And that's the general direction which I would propose to go. I wouldn't force the young to go into these colleges in which they're exposed to the servile orthodoxies of the university culture without first having been given any immunity against those orthodoxies. I would empower them. Well, our time is up. I do want you to react. It seems not fair. I know that. I mean, if you take the world is against all of this stuff that I've said here. So I expect the class to represent the world in some way, and not to be in this. Otherwise, I'm going to be like the Roman juror saying, silence means consent, right? So let's not interpret it that way. And please speak up and speak against. See you next week.